XAnalysts. Empowering analysts, transforming market.
Hello, welcome again. Another episode of Exploring the Energy Markets podcast series. Today, my guest is someone in the industry with deep backgrounds in trading houses like P66, Angel Heart Commodities, Glencore, and someone who has worked at different products and commodities around the oil markets. Pamela Munger, she's the head of market analysis in Europe at Vortexa. Pamela has been with Vortexa from very early founding days, and now Vortexa has been at the forefront of bringing innovative technology. I plan to explore a lot about what's happening in the Hormuz, how to really understand there is so much of the dark trade. So how do we use technology? How do we use innovation to really get ahead and fill in the blanks in the data and still provide transparency and high quality analysis and market insights? So we'll tackle into what's happening in the European markets, what's happening in the, also a little bit about, of course, the trade flows, about the Atlantic Basin markets. And yes, the core focus is indeed to understand about the Middle Eastern crisis. Welcome to this Exploring the Energy Market podcast. What a time we as analysts and looking at the market, what's happening in the Middle East. And of course, there is too much focus on the Middle East, but I'm sure we will talk a lot about are there other areas where market should be focusing as well. But before we go into the market, maybe a quick word about your profile, what you're doing now, what's keeping you busy. I know a few things, but maybe good to hear from you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for having me on, Mukesh. So my name is Pamela Munger, and I am head of market analysis at Vortexa. At Vortexa, of course, we use technology to look at real-time cargo flows, energy flows across the world. And I was one of the first 5 people to join Vortexa before we even had a platform, before we even had a website.
Okay.
So it was very much going and talking to our wonderful founder and CEO, Fabio Kuhn, and having an understanding of what his vision was. I was very much bought into the vision very quickly because I come from many years on the trade floor building supply and demand balances, mainly for middle distillates. And if you remember the time when there were no cargo tracking services, it was about breaking PDF files and probably finding maybe 30% of what was on the water at the time, which really had a big impact on prices. So trying to track on a whiteboard, if I can even say that, or by PDF files, knowing you were missing most of the vessels, I always thought to myself, wouldn't it be great? It feels like so much has been left on the table in order to understand the most opaque part of the business, which was the seaborne part of it, which really seemed to be more and more driving the price movements and getting more and more questions around it with very low visibility. So being able to be a part of building a platform such as ours, which allows that visibility, that transparency, has been wonderful. And then the other piece of it is just the innovation. For a very long time, supply and demand balances were built with data that was 2 months lagged. Yes, it was good data. It was more open source data, but it was very lagged data. So you were always explaining the past before you even got around to forecasting anything even partially correct. So that need to innovate, I always really wanted to build those technology products. So that just came together very, very nicely underneath great leadership. So I've been it's been a real pleasure to be a part of the growth at Vortexa. And I also now get to meet great analysts such as yourself as well. So it's been a very humbling experience.
Now, thank you, Pamela. I think a similar story. I started with running refineries, operating refineries, long years with Shell, and 7 years in trading in Houston. You're so right. We had our own cargo tracking books and models, and we were punching numbers by, of course, gathering a lot of trader intelligence. And I remember then Clipper came in, and a lot many other companies came in. And I, very early on, I did use Vortexa, but now I'm a very proud user as well. We'll talk about the technology side and the innovation side, what differentiates from so much out there. And I think the transparency in the market, but maybe, you know, everybody, the one word, right? Hormuz, everybody is thinking about it. Now it's 2 days of so-called ceasefire. I actually coined the term yesterday, 2 week ceasefire or 2 week ceasefire, right? And it felt to me that this is a very fragile. But what are the numbers telling? Maybe good to start where what's the flow rates, what's the tanker movements actually telling us?
Yeah, I think that's the best part to look at, and we're seeing nobody take up the ceasefire. So I think that's very telling, right? What we've also seen through the news, of course, is a continual bombings of infrastructure in the Middle East Gulf. Mainly, most concerning is the East-West pipeline that is an alternative route, right? That moves a lot of 3.5 million barrels per day of crude to Yanbu for loading, and then now rerouting mainly towards Asia, if not towards Europe. So that was a major alternative outlet. That's very new news. So I don't exactly know what the extent of the damage is. I suspect, it's gonna slow things down, of course. But most importantly, we haven't seen any takers come and move through the Straits of Hormuz. We're also seeing that the ceasefire, it's words right now, I think. If we do start to see clearance, you have over 400, we were counting yesterday, over 400 energy tankers stuck inside Hormuz, and I think it's over 800 total tankers, so dry bulk and various other. So you're looking at a really big backlog. The calculation we spoke about yesterday with our freight team was it takes 1 hour to transit through the straits. That's probably an optimistic view. And so, you can only get 24 vessels through per day. If that's the best rate. So it's going to be slow to move out any tankers from inside the straits. We're not seeing any ballasters necessarily run there. I'm sure they can pivot very quickly if it does look like the straits are opening. But the other piece of the puzzle, of course, is the infrastructure damage. And you're probably very, very well versed in how long it will take to bring up some of the crude production that's been shut in. Now, some of it will probably be quite quick, a couple of weeks, but that's probably the optimistic view, because realistically, in my experience, it takes time to get these things back up, possibly, a month at the longest. And that's probably what we're looking at. Now, that's the crude side of things predominantly. Now, if we look at the refining side of things, that was something I was doing a calculation on yesterday, and I hadn't appreciated all of the unplanned refinery outages due to the various levels of drone attacks that have occurred to these particular refineries. So that's pushed around 1.4 million barrels per day offline until at least this is estimated end of April, end of May, when these refineries can be repaired. That's quite a substantial volume offline in the Middle East Gulf at a time when, the straits haven't cleared, but let's just say we're in a position where they do clear. You're still talking about prolonged outages during the summer, where certainly Europe is dependent on Middle East Gulf middle distillate supplies, but Asia is going to probably take it before Europe gets it, right? Because Asia's really conserving, yes, some of their activities around middle distillate demand, but they're also curbing exports and refinery runs.
Now, I think you painted what a fantastic picture, and I think, I didn't appreciate the level of the non, energy, of course, carriers which are stuck there. And what my impression, and correct me if it is wrong, is almost 100 million barrels of crude is stuck, almost 50 million barrels of product is stuck, almost 2.3 million cubic meters of LNG is stuck. And if you go back to the rates, I did some estimate that if you go back to the rates, normal rates, these things will take about 10, 15 days, but we are not in normal time. So you're right that it will be a trickle rather than a big flow out of the Hormuz.
And we haven't even
So
started to see the trickle yet, have
yeah,
we?
we haven't started
Yeah.
to see. Yeah, and you also, I think, raise an excellent point around. I call Hormuz kind of the heart attack of the oil markets, and then we have the Red Sea, which is kind of the bypass. And if the bypass also gets attacked in some shape or form, then it's really we could see a much bigger impact. And so far, my view is it's a half Hormuz problem. We haven't lost 20 million barrels per day. Everybody keeps talking about that number. Do you agree with that? That the size of the loss is market really understanding the size of the loss, or maybe what is market missing, Pamela?
Yeah, I think the market is missing the longevity afterwards. Okay, so if you look
Mhm.
at if you look at crude futures, even this morning after some of the information came out overnight about how the straits aren't really opening up, you can see that the futures hasn't really moved up very much, and to me this is very confusing because you know that suggests that there's still hope that the straits will open up and that energy will flow quite freely in a couple of months' time. However, there's no current indication with even the ceasefire that things are loosening up. So, hope is a good thing. However, I think that I'm not sure it's so wise to have that going forward. Now, there's been some alleviation. I mean, these are mainly crude futures, and yes, I realize that this is a definitely obviously a problem for crude for Asia. However, the licensing, the OFAC has issued these licenses for Russia. What does that do? What does that mean? That means that certainly that India has been able to take Russian crude sort of legally, if you will. And then I saw this morning that the U.S. has extended that license for another 30 days, which puts us somewhere into July. So that's another indication that this isn't going to be resolved anytime soon. I
Anytime
think
soon.
if you're looking for signals, I agree with you. I think we've been lucky so far, I guess it's what you call it, in terms of the Bab and Deb Straits, because all of those alternative supplies loading out of Yanbu for both crude and to some degree refined products as well have been flowing fairly freely, predominantly going to Asia where they're much needed. And we could see, obviously if the Bab and Deb is put back into jeopardy, which is the threat, that the problem could be
Could
exasperated.
be bigger. Yeah.
Correct.
But maybe I'll ask you this. I mean, my view has been that all of the Yanbu barrels from Saudi Arabia are actually going to China. If I look at the maximum data, there was a lot of Russian barrels flowing through the Red Sea. When Saudis started using the Red Sea, the Russian numbers actually went quite down. Now, all the Saudi barrels, they're going to China, and Iran and China are kind of in that connected. So I had a hypothesis that Iran will not ask Houthis to go and attack the Bab al-Mandeb, but I'm surprised by Iran actually attacking the pipeline from which the crude is going to China. So any take or any impressions on how to really understand this?
Yeah, I mean, the geopolitics side of it are
Is hard.
at
Yeah.
best confusing. It's a difficult one, right? I think that most analysts, and we went through this in June of last year, never thought that the straits would close because all parties interested would make sure that wouldn't happen, right? So to all best interest, the straits wouldn't close. Now Iran has continued, and matter of fact, their exports have continued to be very high at hit historical highs in terms of getting flows through the straits, loading at Carg Island. They were even loading at Carg Island yesterday. Normally, or it was Tuesday. The week's gone by so fast.
Yeah, Tuesday.
Under the biggest threat, and you think surely they've moved everything away, and no, sure enough, they're still loading from some of the satellite imagery that we can collect. So, it is confusing indeed. What I think, going forward, I don't know. I suspect the U.S. has probably gotten in over its head now, if you look at it from a geopolitical perspective. But now the question is how do you get out of this? Once you poke a hornet's nest, how do you actually then leave? And the other thing, and this is what's been interesting with the technology, is now you have the situation where I think the U.S. is probably going, wow, okay, this is bigger than what we expected it to become. Let's put out some statements out there that rein this in a bit. But I think that's what's interesting with the technology is you can actually see what's going on. So despite there being headlines that say the straits are open, or we can see what's happening through the straits. We can see what's actually going on. So I think that's a new twist.
No, you're right, and you're so right that Iran is still loading, and I saw some numbers from all the propane cargoes Iran is loading and going to China, right? So I think it's a very interesting. Let me ask you. Said that we don't have to look at the statements in the newspaper. We just look at the data by the cargo tracking, and we know it, whether it's open or not. I wanted to understand, in order to get more granularity, what technological innovation at Vortexa, Pamela, you needed to do to even get better at tracking compared to how things were happening before. Any new things you have done?
Yes, we have, and you probably remember the story about the GPS jamming and the AIS spoofing happening in the Middle East, and that's in the Middle East Gulf, inside the Straits. So at the beginning of the conflict, so the end of February, that started to amplify. So to take a step back, the Iranian movements of vessels typically go dark, so they turn off their AIS signal to move through, and that we're used to, and we have a specialist in New York who looks at that at a very deep level using satellite imagery and sort of repasting the movements, if you will, in the background, along with our R&D department. So she works very closely with the data scientist to sort of retrace those movements so that we're at like a 2 to 3 day lag on Iranian loading.
So let me get this right. I think this is important. What you're mentioning is that if the AIS signals are turned off, right, we can still see. It's maybe dark for others, but for those who have the technology, you can still track and retrace the movement. That's very interesting.
That's correct. And that's because we've, and this is what's so fascinating and I think gives us certainly as a unique differentiator, is because we have, yes, we have AI, and AI is wonderful and helps us process all of these data points. But when you have a lack of data points, you really need the humans. Some call it the humans in the loop, and we have very, very sharp humans who work with our data scientists to re-put together these signals. So for example, our data scientists, our R&D guys have and girls have built in the background a separate system just tracing the signals. Okay, and this is a complete unique proprietary sort of system where we can see the signal frequencies, and you can essentially, yes, retrace pings where they've left off, what makes sense now, and that's become very relevant because of, yes, the Iranian flows, which historically have been dark, so that's a subset. However, at the end of February, when the conflict started, you also saw this GPS jamming and AIS spoofing happening outside of the Iranian flows. So just the normal vessels were
also doing it.
We're also doing it. Because it conflicted with the war signals. I don't know the specifics, to be honest with you. But because we had that experience, we could then apply that experience tracking the Iranian cargoes to what was happening. So we then assessed the situation and said, okay, let's create a process to where every single day we're looking at the vessels inside, the vessels outside of the straits, the ballisters, and let's match, because the vessel trails were throwing those vessels all over the place. And so you had to, number one, check what was being thrown out, and then you go into this background system, and then you can look at the signaling and say, there's no way that vessel is there, and then you reposition it. And so we've been doing that every day since.
Okay. Fascinating, Pamela.
It's like building a Legos and breaking it apart and then rebuilding it again every single day. So
I think information plays a big role, so that there is also as we all know that rumors mill. I think good that the likes of Vortexa and others are able to break those fake news and clearly outline. I want to now get into too much understanding of how it is impacting the Asian markets, right? Because Hormuz was very much an Asian artery. Maybe if we look at European side of the equation, are there any chokages? Are there in other choke points, and how the vessels are getting rerouted in Europe? Are there other Hormuz-like choke points emerging in the world, Pamela, somewhere, and we are not paying attention?
Well, I would say more of a diversion issue. So in terms of Europe, Europe crude stocks have actually been building. The European Union in general, plus the UK, still receives a lot of crude, of course, from the Mediterranean, the Gulf of Mexico as well. So in terms of crude, Europe is well stocked. And
well
has
stocked.
And has
Okay.
Well stocked, definitely well stocked. And even for diesel, which this surprised me, I was looking at the as you know, we partner with Argus, which produce inventory data for global inventory data, which shows ARA stocks for diesel actually building, which is a bit of a surprise. So they're in sort of normal levels. Nothing to get excited about. And even with the current situation, the lack of diesel coming in from the Middle East Gulf, you're still seeing a build. Now, what you are seeing as well, so that was a surprise, right? Which probably...
I have a view on it, but complete,
okay.
And then I'll share that.
Okay. Which probably meant that is why there were several diesel cargoes loaded out of the U.S. Gulf Coast that diverted and went to Asia.
Yeah.
So that was very interesting and very unusual. U.S. diesel doesn't flow to Asia. There's that arb is never rarely open.
But maybe if I touch upon on the Europe side, so you're saying crude is okay, products are okay. My gut feel, and not been proved, and probably you can prove with more data, Pamela, is that given the situation, is Europe turning a little bit blind eye to the Russian diesel, Russian flows, and there is a higher leakage of those flows via Turkey or other countries into the system? Now is not the time to go and full blow the enforcement, because then you kind of shoot yourself on the foot. Is there a way to track? Is there a way to really look at these numbers, whether it's a Russian diesel leaking into the system or what's happening? So I think can we really look at that surprise?
Yeah, I look, even at the height of the need for Russian barrels into Europe, we looked at this in a very granular level. And to be honest with you, we really didn't see any notable rerouting of Russian diesel into Europe. It was even through Turkey. Turkey, of course, was importing vast amounts and really using it for domestic demand. I mean, yes, we saw a lot coming out of Turkey, but we really did try and do a deep dive study on what was happening. And our conclusion was that it was negligible volumes, if anything, being sort of transshipped at ports or anything like that. So look, I haven't seen anything like that so far. It's a bit early in the game, and that is risky business. So yeah, it's something to keep an eye on.
Yeah, nothing good to get the clarification. Yeah, now, in terms of, you talked about the crude flows, right? WTI barrels have been probably flowing a lot to Europe and European refinery coming out of the maintenance. So as we go toward the Northern Hemisphere summer, what are your thoughts on the European side of the market? Any key points you want to mention?
Absolutely. So this is where it's going to get really interesting if the straits don't open up, right? Because so you also have, and I'm not an expert on LNG, but you have LNG supplies, of course, trapped, the force majeure in Qatar. So a lack of LNG coming out of the Middle East Gulf. I also read that Israel, of course, have cut out gas supplies again to Egypt. And so this is setting up the picture very similar to what we saw last summer. And why is that so important? It's because the lack of power generation, the lack of LNG supplies for power generation in the Med during the summer when it's very hot, especially in Egypt, meant that they were pulling in large amounts of diesel at the time. So in addition to that, I will also say that the Haifa refinery has been damaged as well in Israel. That is a copy paste of what we saw last summer. And distillate cracks don't usually surge during the summer, as you know. It's usually a gasoline story, but they went crazy last year because of this unexpected need for essentially diesel for power generation in the Mediterranean because of the lack of LNG supplies. And LNG. I think, and we are setting ourselves up for that exact same scenario to happen, even if the straits do open. That's why I mentioned all that Middle East Gulf refinery damage that still needs to get repaired and come back up. Refineries are a bit more delicate in that sense. You have to get all of those repairs done, right? So that takes some time, and we're quickly accelerating into the summer.
No, you're so right, and I guess that in some ways, until it kind of hits the summer pinch on the US side or the Europe side, my view is that unless China, European leaders, Russia, US sit on the table, there is no resolution. You won't get the resolution by getting through, some of the countries, smaller countries, less powerful countries in the Middle East. I think a good attempt by Pakistan, I would say, but I think to get the ceasefire really done, you need the powerful players, Russia, China on the table. And probably they are winning at this point of time. US is winning a lot by exporting. Russia is winning by maybe exporting less, but by higher prices. China is winning
Absolutely.
by buying a lot more barrels. And I somehow feel that it's not one Hormuz we are dealing with. South Korea actually telling that they will restrict exports, Thailand restricting exports, China restricting exports. Is kind of creating a lot of mini Hormuzes around the world. So while the one is not open, we might see small mini Hormuz kind of scenarios coming. And so I think the summer is going to be pretty, hot and exciting. How about jet, Pamela? Is that an okay thing, or we have a problem there?
Yeah, I think in terms of Europe, we're certainly seeing jet storage or jet inventories uh, falling quite rapidly, well below the seasonal averages and below the seasonal lows. That jet cargo typically would come from the Middle East Gulf, as you know, one of the main suppliers, as well as India West Coast. Now, those flows from India will obviously be directed towards Asia. And with the refinery damage to the extent that we see it, we're also going to likely expect lower flows out of the Middle East Gulf. So I can definitely see a case where, jet cargo prices remain extremely elevated. I don't think we're in necessarily any shortage territory as of yet in terms of airlines. I don't know, but then the summer hasn't yet started. So that is definitely one to watch. That could be precarious.
Well, you triggered a thought, but I'm going to ask the question. I'll leave it there. And the thought is, what is Europe going to do now that India will process a lot of Russian barrels? Will they accept the Indian Russian made products? I don't know the answer. Summer is not yet started, and let's wait for the summer to come. Thank you a lot about market, but I do want to spend some time, Pamela, on your long years in the industry. What inspiring words, what words would you want to give to the analysts who are looking at these tricky markets, who may not have any reference of history, right? A lot of young people for the first time. So maybe, top 3 things you would advise and guide people. Hey, watch out, look this. What comes to your mind?
Yeah, I would say, top 3, only 3. I would say, try and take maybe one product at a time and analyze before you try and interconnect everything. I think that's really important, and I tell our graduate analysts that start with one, really dig into the details of the main flows and build up from there. Start with middle distillates, move to light ends, move to crude, one at a time, instead of trying to boil the ocean, because that's the thing I see with new analysts, is it can be overwhelming, and then that's it. Then they can't make any real valid solid connections, right? So
So true.
so true. And despite the refinery side, what people interpret as sort of, I don't know why, as sort of boring or too granular, that's often the most telling. So learn what's going on with the refineries. That's where your demand for crude is. That's your only demand for crude. And that's where your supply is coming. And that has shifted the balances in the last 10, 20 years completely, and the power along with it. So follow refineries closer than you think you need to. And then I would also say, get a good handle on pricing, yes, but really the fundamentals in terms of your breaking down by region. I'm not sure if I'm doing a very good job on the only 3. The other thing I would say is certainly take your time, solidify your knowledge. Reach out to mentors such as yourself. I think that we're all very open to have these discussions. And I would also say just keep going, one step at a time. Sometimes in the analyst world, you think you're never going to get there, but that's part of the fun of it, is there's always something new to try and figure out. It's like a puzzle that never ends.
No, it's like a puzzle that never ends. And I think I always, learned the hard way, the time value of insights. You can get the best insight, but too late. So if you have 3 data points, put the 3 data points together and generate one signal. is better than collecting 10 data points and then signals get mixed, right? So if you see something, say something. That was my model, and don't wait and sit on the information before it's too late. But I think also, following the refineries, that's music to my ears, because I really, I'm a refineries person all my life. So I think that's very telling, as you rightly say. Okay, fantastic. I think some inspiring words. Before I let you go, crystal ball, any calls, any projections? I know it's a risky thing to make calls these days. You can get wrong tomorrow morning. But still, is this a long war? And is this short war? And maybe some thoughts why you think it's a long war, why you think it's a short war.
Sure. I think going into this, I thought it would be a short war, to be honest. However, certainly I would say in the last 2 weeks, I think that view has changed. I think this is going to be a longer war than anyone expected in terms of certainly the supply chain. So I think it's going to be a long time before you see the supply chain, which is the flows out of through the straits, return to normal. I think when the threats to the straits have been removed for a sustained period of time, then you could start to see things normalize. But I also think we haven't even begun to take the first step in that process. Yes.
No, I think you're right that maybe the militarily war, maybe, it can be over, or those, but I think the normalization process, the supply chain disruption, it will take a long time. And I know we had a lot of people thought that when vaccination was there, COVID is over. No, vaccination just doesn't mean COVID is over. So I guess on that note, that Hormuz opening doesn't mean everything is normal.
And can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
I also think that now that Iran has known leverage to close the straits, that card will now and forever always be played. So I think the next thing to look at, and we can do a podcast in a year or so, is to look at alternative infrastructure. So that will be, I think, very interesting to see how Saudi, how Qatar, how Iraq start to build out pipelines to the Med, pipelines to the Red Sea, etc., alternative ways to get their energy out. And the longer this goes on, they have to be thinking along those lines. Energy, I don't know if you remember Jurassic Park, but this is this is a strange metaphor, but this sticks to me every single time. Ever since the straits were closed, there was a quote that said, "Life always finds a way." In the first Jurassic Park, and I feel that way with energy. It always finds a way to get out. No, it's infrastructure barriers and logistics.
No, I think you made a very excellent point, and I think it would be worthwhile to do a podcast on the topic, because we already know Singapore has started saying we are not going to pay toll in Hormuz, because then Malaysia might ask toll in Straits of Malacca. So now a lot of toll booths emerge across the globe, and I think every country which is sitting near a choke point must be thinking about alternates. And I think the world will not be the same again, even if Hormuz opens. With that note, thank you, Pamela, coming on a very short notice, very important, critical topic. And I think hearing from you what you're doing and how Vortexa and your teams are working, really fascinating. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
XAnalysts. Empowering analysts, transforming markets.